This is James Corbett of CorbettReport.com here in the sunny climes of Western Japan, but joining me on the line, as always, from the dreary climes of Portland, Oregon, is my good friend, James Evan Pilato. James, thank you for joining me again today.
Thanks a lot, man. I appreciate it.
Well, I understand that you just got back from the studio recording the latest episode of your MediaMonarchy.com podcast, so I'm looking forward to that. But in the meantime, let's cover some stories. What's the first story you got for us today?
The first story we want to hit, and of course we thought the G20 was only in Pittsburgh, as we saw just recently. However, we have learned from author and investigative journalist Daniel Estulin, author of the Bilderberg Group by Trine Books from here in Oregon. There is a new G20 meeting that is occurring pretty much literally as we speak, November 6th and 7th in Scotland. So a press release, author says G20 meeting in Scotland this week about dumping the U.S. dollar. Best-selling author Daniel Estulin states that the key issue to be discussed this week at the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors meeting being held in St. Andrews, Scotland, is how to bring down the present world financial system through dumping the U.S. dollar. Estulin first reported on this initiative as being deliberated at the most recent Bilderberg meeting held in Greece in May of 2009. Daniel Estulin says that the success or failure of this callous plan hinges on the ability of the U.S. and U.K. representatives to convince the Russian, the Chinese, and other national governments to go along with their scheme. This scheme, put quite simply, is the deindustrialization, the pulling the rug out from the middle class of the United States.
Right, and this is particularly interesting because it does relate back to what Estulin was saying about the Bilderberg conference earlier this year, and people might remember from my interview with him earlier this year, he was talking about the coming collapse, and now we see that maybe the G20 is being used to organize the dumping of the dollar. But I haven't heard really much, if any, other press coverage about this G20 conference. Have you seen anything about the finance ministers meeting other than this report from Estulin?
This is the only bit. And then, of course, all the great alternative media that have picked up this press release. Again, of course, for some reason, all our multinational mainstream media corporations aren't going to tell us about this. And I think it's important to note, too, that it's not necessarily that those dastardly Russians and Chinese are going to dump the dollar secretly. This is an organized scheme from the banksters who really hold no allegiance to any one sovereign nation state.
Right, exactly, as we have to understand that the financial collapse was a controlled demolition, as Max Kaiser puts it. We have to understand that the dumping of the dollar is also going to be a controlled demolition, and it's going to serve to benefit some of the elite financial oligarch interests. But, of course, a lot of people will be thrown under the bus, and that will include the vast majority of people out there, including probably you and definitely me. So definitely something to keep our eye on. Well, let's move on to our second story today. Today, actually, we'll be covering something. I'm a Canadian citizen, so recently I saw some very interesting news, and in fact, a little bit of a good sign, I think, ultimately, about the RCMP, which, of course, is the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Canadian National Police Force. And it just came out just last week that there is new legislation tabled to stop the RCMP investigating itself. So I wrote an article about it that's available on CorbettReport.com. New Democrat MP Nathan Cullen has tabled legislation in the Canadian Parliament that would prevent the Royal Canadian Mounted Police from investigating its own in situations where there are concerns about officer misconduct. The legislation comes on the back of a report by a parliamentary RCMP watchdog that concluded that there was a need for an independent body to investigate incidents resulting in deaths and serious injuries of people in police custody. The RCMP currently conducts its own internal investigations when there are suspicions that a Mountie has acted inappropriately in the course of her or his duties. And as I go on to talk about in this article, this is on the back of numerous complaints over the last several years about RCMP misconduct, and the parliamentary watchdog that I mentioned in that article had a specific report that listed about 28 incidents that they looked at of the RCMP investigating itself into such things as the murder of Ian Bush, a 22-year-old who was arrested by the RCMP and then shot in the back of the head after being brought back to the police detachment. And it was eventually, of course, ruled that there was no wrongdoing in that case, but that provoked a lot of outrage. And of course, the most famous was the 2007 death of Robert Zikansky, who died at the Vancouver International Airport after being tasered to death. And again, the RCMP concluded that there was no wrongdoing in that case. And as I go on, the article is interesting. Probably I buried the lead because at the end it talks about the most important information, which is about some of the wrongdoings of the RCMP in the past and how that led to the creation of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. And that's a fascinating story, and it goes into Air India and all sorts of other things. So I hope people will check that out, because there's a lot of interesting information there, not just for Canadians, but for people who love freedom all around the world. So we can only hope that this legislation gets passed, although it's a private member's bill, so it may not get passed in the Canadian Parliament unless people out there help to get it passed. And moving right along, I guess, moving into number 3, I understand you have sort of a related story talking about this type of issue.
We do. So, keeping within the continental borders of the possible North American Union, but moving down into these United States, we learn that the FBI, from their own admission, has 400,000 people on a watch list with 1,600 names added a day. This new information comes by way of Stephen Aftergood's Secrecy News over at FAS.org. Basically, newly released FBI data offers evidence of the broad scope and complexity of the nation's terrorist watch list, documenting a daily flood of names nominated for inclusion to the controversial list. Now, this report comes from the Washington Post, and you thought that all the Patriot Act and the war on terror, that was for those other people. We and many other people have said for a long, long time that this was always meant for us. This isn't exactly groundbreaking new news, but it's definitely something to kind of smack you around and say, see, this is still going on. I also think it'll be interesting to see what happens as we head into the holiday season. And if we have 400,000 plus names on this watch list, which of course ties in with the no-fly list, tie that in with the naked body terahertz scanners at the airport and all those things, and we've got probably another dastardly holiday season coming up.
That's exactly right, and it's exactly right that we're just being slowly indoctrinated to sort of accept this, and we're being eased into this system where there are these lists and there are massive amounts of people on them. And occasionally something like this comes out, and I think it is important, although you're right, it's not a news story per se, because we already knew these lists existed, but it's good to get some numbers on this type of thing and to put this into perspective every now and then, and realize just how far along the police state is already advanced. And again, it's one of those issues that we have to keep pressing back against this type of thing, or it will unfortunately continue. So definitely good to keep that in mind. And as you did just come back from recording your latest episode of Media Monarchy, why don't you tell us a little bit about what we might expect to hear this week?
Well, I'm, like you said, kind of hot off the presses, so I'm still jazzed up and kind of in work mode, and I'm literally editing as we speak, and there's so many things, and of course they all seem to tie in one way or another. We essentially have what we've called before what seems to be almost a mass murder contagion. We have the Fort Hood shooting event, which took place yesterday. Remember the 5th of November. I have a massive post on MediaMonarchy.com going over what always seems to be the classic case of when an event like this happens. You hear these conflicting stories, you hear these witness responses about 3 shooters, military fatigues. They used military weapons, but then it was one guy, lone gunman, handgun. The story changes. We now today have a shooting in Orlando. And again, I just kind of refer to it as a mass murder contagion. We have the swine flu updates and all the strange goings-on in the Ukraine tied in with Baxter. We've got the Econo crash. The Audit the Fed bill is pretty much dead. But one thing we want to close out with is an interesting kind of nod and wink, and we're not a doomsday cult, but flashback to the future from February 2007, billboards urge preparedness for attack on 11/9. That's Monday.
It certainly is. So let's keep our eye out on that one. All right. James, MediaMonarchy.com, FoodWorldOrder.com, CyberspaceWar.com.
That's it.
Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks so much, man.